Всем привет! Мы здесь с Грегом Гонсалвесом, одним из ветеранов ACT UP, с которым мы хотим сегодня поговорить о фигуре одного из, наверное, самых известных и самых противоречивых, возможно, для кого-то борцов с эпидемией ВИЧ-инфекции, человеком, который очень много сделал для того, чтобы вообще у нас что-то в области ВИЧ-инфекции происходило. So basically, Greg, I just gave a brief introduction of you as an all-time activist, an ACT UP veteran, and the person who has witnessed it all, probably, and announced that we are going to talk a little bit about Dr. Fauci and his figure due to his upcoming retirement. So, Daria, would you like to start?
Yes, Greg, if you're ready, I would you to ask the first question. How would you briefly describe Fauci's role in the fight against the AIDS epidemic?
So, Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, came to the NIH in the 1970s. And by the middle of the 1980s, he was already the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In the United States, this is one of the several institutes that combined to form the National Institutes of Health. And his institute basically deals with all infectious diseases, plus sort of immunological conditions like allergies, immunodeficiencies, and things like that. Of course, being at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the middle of the 1980s, means that you were there on the spot when the AIDS epidemic arrived in the US at the same time, right? So he was in charge of research on infectious diseases. A new infectious disease emerged, and he was in the catbird seat. He, as the saying goes in English, he was right in the center of the action as it started thinking about what research needed to be done on this new virus sweeping the United States and sweeping the world.
Thank you. And in your opinion, what actions?
Let me. Why there were many public health officials involved, right, at that time? Why do you think that the figure of the Fauci was so crucial, so specific, and still gets so much attention for what about was happening back then?
Well, there were other people at CDC and other places in the federal government. The reason Dr. Fauci is so present in our thinking about infectious diseases is he outlasted them all, right? There were many great and not so great and terrible people throughout the course of the past 40 years working on HIV/AIDS, whether at the CDC or other places. But Dr. Fauci basically, what is he, 82 or 81? He's been there almost all of my adult life, and through the course of the entire epidemic. Other people have retired, moved on to other things, but he remains, right? I think the other important thing to mention is that it's not just HIV. Anytime we've had an infectious disease emergency in the US, there he is, right? Because he's our most senior, long-standing infectious disease expert in the country, even if we have CDC directors, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which does our sort of public health work in the United States, as opposed to the National Institute of Health, which does our biomedical research. Whether it was H1N1 influenza, Ebola, SARS, the original one, a whole bunch of any infectious disease that sort of was on the map of the United States, there was Dr. Fauci, and that's why he maintains sort of a central role in the imagination of the American public, even through the COVID pandemic here around the world and the monkeypox epidemic as it has exploded around the world as well.
Cool, thanks. Dasha, go ahead.
Greg, in your opinion, what actions of Dr. Fauci can be described as successful?
So, Dr. Fauci had a very successful research career before AIDS. There's a disease called Wegener's granulomatosis. God, I probably butchered the name of it, but he developed a cure for it, right? A good friend of mine who worked on HIV/AIDS happened to have that in the 80s, and Dr. Fauci was the go-to guy for that. So he had a very sort of successful career as a young scientist, a young man. what's been important is that he has done several things. And the last one probably is more relevant to sort of our discussion. One is that he gave AIDS a prominence in US discussions at the highest levels of government from the very beginning. Being a telegenic, articulate spokesman, he could talk to presidents from Reagan all the way up to our current one, Biden, about the threats of infectious disease, including HIV/AIDS. So we couldn't have a better spokesman for that work. He also shepherded, a really, really large research portfolio of millions and millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars over the course of the years in the United States. It's a huge sort of undertaking, and we had problems with it. We tussled with him at the beginning of the 1990s about his leadership. But again, he shepherded the AIDS research portfolio for close to 30, 40 years. And finally, he did something interesting, which I think is relevant to our sort of activist thinking, is that when he got protested in the late 80s, early 90s, he didn't sort of say, stay away, go away, and scorn people living with AIDS, people who use drugs, people who are in sex work, etc. He said, come on in, right? He said, we need your insights. We want to be part of a collaboration with you. And he opened the doors to the research enterprise to activists and people living with HIV. This meant that we were part of discussions about how clinical trials should run. As we learned more and as we pushed our way further into the system, we were talking to them about basic research, molecular biology and immunology and virology. We were talking to them about behavioral research on prevention, to prevent HIV via sexual contact or through intravenous drug use. We were talking to them about the overarching priorities in AIDS research. So Tony opened the door and we rushed in, but he could have been, no, not on my watch, over my dead body. We don't want people with AIDS. We don't want non-experts in these discussions, but he opened the door. And while there was resistance in the scientific community at the beginning, they also ended up welcoming us with open arms, saying, you make our research better. You know what's going on in the community. You know what's going on in your own bodies, and you do your homework, right? You don't come in just pounding on the table saying, you need to listen to me because I'm living with HIV. You've done all the research on the drugs, on the clinical trials, on the diseases. You know about the immune system, you know about virology. So you can have policy discussions with us, not necessarily as complete equals, because you don't have the medical training or the scientific training, but you know enough to help us think through the questions we're asking in a way that makes the most sense. So that's what I'd say his big contributions were.
Thanks. As I understood right, Dr. Fauci heard the ACT UP voice. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. I would reinforce the question. Like, he definitely heard the ACT UP voice, but what do you think played the crucial role? Was it like his personality? Or because you say you have to do your homework, right? You have to be prepared in order to talk to all these smart guys. And obviously, at the very early stages of ACT UP, there were not too much geeks and nerds like yourself and Mark and others. So there were a lot of protest and anger. Why did it hurt you?
So a couple of things. One is there were a lot of geeks in ACT UP, a lot of people who were interested in the science. But, the reason Dr. Fauci opened up the doors is because we were banging on them. I remember the front AIDS protests in Russia from many years ago. We were doing exactly what you did, and banging on the doors, not taking no for an answer, doing die-ins at the National Institutes of Health. In the early 90s, there was a demonstration called Storm the NIH. Now, the NIH is in a suburban district outside of Washington, D.C., right? Very suburban. Think of Moscow and think of driving 100 miles out. And there's a campus with trees and rolling hills and these very old buildings. one day in the early 1990s, thousands of people living with AIDS and their advocates descended on the National Institutes of Health, smoke bombs, placards, fake skeletons, fake tombstones, banging on the doors, marching to his building, jumping up on the awning of the front door. So right in front of the building, there's an awning, people were draping banners over it. That was the day when Tony realized I needed to open the door before they pushed them in, right? So it wasn't just because we were nerds and he thought, they had some good ideas, I'll open the doors. He was smart. It's better. So there's a saying in English, it's better to have people pissing from the inside of the tent outwards than pissing on the tent, right? So he figured bring them in rather than let them be on the outside. But if we had opened the doors and we were not helpful, we were useless, we were destructive, there would be no reason to sort of let us continue our role or expand our role. And so it was important that we did the homework, but what got us in the first place was protest. And just as an aside, as we did less protest, we became less influential for them. So you had to do the protest and the nerdy science stuff, right? You had to do your homework, but also be able to protest, because it's the inside outside strategy. The outside is the protest saying, we demand to be heard, you will listen to us, we have something to say. And the inside is, okay, this is what we have to say, this is why it's important, this is why it's true, this is why you should do what we're asking. So you need to do the protest and the policy at the same time.
Do you have the feeling that now activism has become too diplomatic and we lack protests, furious protests as previously?
Well, Dennis, we have a mutual friend in India, Lun Gangte, who just finished, I think, a 30 or 40-day sit-in in the National AIDS Program offices. So there are protests still going on around the world. What's happened to a lot of AIDS activism is we've become institutionalized, particularly in the US. When Ronald Reagan and his successor, George Bush, were terrible on HIV. When Bill Clinton came into the White House, everybody was like, oh, we're saved, it's all going to be better. It was not true, but everybody sort of let down their guard, right? And then in 1996, the new AIDS drugs, which basically turned AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable illness for many, took the pressure off, right? And so activism, many people just went back to their old lives, or they took jobs with the Clinton administration, or they went to work for a big NGO, etc. And the same thing happened with AIDS in the 21st century. We all fought and screamed and yelled for access to antiretrovirals, front AIDS, ITPC-RU, all these different groups around the world, including in Russia. But by the middle of the 2000s, a lot of the heat was off as the world scaled up antiretroviral therapy. What we saw with COVID-19 vaccines, for instance, showed us our work is not done. For all the successes and access to medicines, many places around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, don't even have any doses of vaccine. And so there's a lot of reasons to protest, because we made progress in very certain areas, but many people are dying of HIV. Many people who use drugs are not getting access to clean needles, to methadone, buprenorphine. We still have so many things to do that are not just going to be usefully done by being part of the system or being part of a big NGO or at a university like where I sit. I think we need to rediscover our roots. There's a health journalist here in the United States named Ed Yong, and he wrote a piece a few months ago asking if public health had lost its way. In the 19th century, we all used to be activists. The great advances in public health were because we improved sanitation. We were able to change the way people lived in terms of crowded housing. That was all campaigning and advocacy and screaming and yelling. Even the big health systems in Europe, like the National Health Service in the UK, was based on activism of people, 10, 20, 30 years before them. And so, it's not just in HIV that perhaps we've forgotten how to protest. I think across public health, global health, we don't realize the power of non-technical work in getting our elected officials, our leaders, to do the right thing.
Okay, back to Fauci, Daria, sorry.
Greg, you mentioned about drugs. It's appeared in 1996. Do you think it would be possible to speed up the drug development? And if so, could Fauci contribute this process? If
So new drug development for HIV or?
So
HIV.
Yeah, I suppose it was like the question in past tense. Would it have been possible to do it faster?
Yeah.
Faster.
As David Barr, who Dennis knows well, said in a movie called How to Survive a Plague, we got lucky in 1996, right? You know, we with Dr. Fauci and activists, we were able to really increase funding for AIDS research, even though we had a very hostile administration under Ronald Reagan and George Bush in the 1980s, right? We were able to go from zero to over $1 billion in AIDS research funding, which made possible some of the advances that led to the development of the protease inhibitors and highly active antiretroviral therapy. So did we, you know, speed up drug development directly? No, but we turned the heat up, right, on the US government to put money into HIV research, and Fauci was a good ambassador for it, right? What I think we did together is to make AIDS research better, to answer questions that were important to us about, you know, the treatment and prevention of opportunistic infections, the need to tackle the specific opportunistic infections that women living with HIV get, right? Cervical cancer, pelvic inflammatory disease, which are not part of the original AIDS definition in the United States. So we made AIDS research better. We made a whole lot of advances happen. In terms of drug development, I think it was the sheer force of the work we all did that elevated the fight to look for good treatments to a higher level. If we had only had $10 million, $100 million, $200 million for AIDS research in the United States, we wouldn't have made successes. But then again, you know, money isn't everything, right? There are many diseases that don't have treatments for them. Even now, we don't have an HIV, excuse me, we don't have an HIV vaccine. So sometimes money and pressure and politics don't make a difference. But we were really lucky too in 1996 that these drugs arrived, even though, you know, part of the work we did was responsible for it. A lot of it was just sheer luck.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have any more questions?
The last questions. Have you heard of Kennedy's book, The Real Anthony Fauci? If you have read, do you think Fauci's criticism in the book are justified or no?
So I'm going to go back a little bit. So in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, particularly in the 80s and 90s, there were people in the United States who said, you know, HIV isn't the cause of AIDS. AZT is poison. These people did a lot of damage in the United States and convinced a lot of people not to get tested, not to take AIDS treatment. And, you know, I'll call them what they are. They were murderers. And there were people like Peter Duesberg, who was a scientist at the University of California at Berkeley, Carrie Mullis, who was a Nobel Prize winner, totally, you know, garbage science, no credibility whatsoever, but they were incredibly important. Now let's fast forward to 2000. Thabo Mbeki is the president of South Africa. He hears all this and says, even though I have the biggest AIDS epidemic in the world in my country, we will not give antiretroviral therapy to our people because HIV doesn't cause AIDS and AZT and AIDS drugs are poison. So this disinformation, this AIDS denialism was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths in South Africa. A Harvard School of Public Health study showed several years later that this delay in getting antiretroviral therapy because of misinformation was incredibly damaging and in South Africa and led to thousands of people dying premature deaths. Now we're at COVID-19. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, by the way, is scorned by his family. His family is like, whatever. We love him, but on vaccines, he is absolutely wrong, absolutely irresponsible. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is part of the anti-vax movement, vaccine denialism in the United States. There's plenty of people who say, not only the COVID-19 vaccines don't work, but we shouldn't be vaccinating kids for diseases like measles, mumps, rubella, polio, and it's done enormous damage. Here in the United States, 100 miles, even 50 miles from me, we have polio outbreaks in 2022. And it's in communities that refuse to get vaccinated because of this anti-vax hysteria that people like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Have disseminated across the country and across the world. And so his book on Anthony Fauci is a hit job. It's a pack of lies meant to service his anti-vaccine agenda, which, between you and me, I don't get it, right? We all know that vaccines save lives. Take COVID off the table. We know that we live in an era in which many childhood diseases we simply don't worry about because we don't get them. My dad got polio when he was 2 years old. My mother had rheumatic fever when she was a kid. There are plenty of us who have grandparents who died early deaths from infectious diseases, which we now don't even worry about. And so I don't understand how Robert F. Kennedy and that whole group of people he's associated with, and it's an international group, right? I'm sure in Russia there are people.
Absolutely.
But it's all fake science and conspiracy theories. It's like it's like saying the earth is flat, that evolution isn't true, that we were created by God in 7 days, that there are Martians living on the moon. That's the level of the thinking that Robert F. Kennedy is offering, the American people and any other people who read his book. If his name wasn't Robert F. Kennedy Jr., he would be a garden variety crank, crazy person, conspiracy theorist with a tinfoil hat on, looking for UFOs in his backyard. But he's a Kennedy, so he gets attention. Again, his family has disowned him for this kind of nonsense. Scientists across the globe, not just in the US, realize, think of him as a joke, but also a dangerous man in the sense that he's discouraging people from getting vaccinated, and not just for COVID-19, but for a whole host of other diseases. And that makes people sick. So like Thabo Mbeki, or the AIDS denialists from the 1980s, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. probably has blood on his hands. For the people who died from COVID who didn't need to die from COVID, for the children who've gotten infectious diseases that were once preventable in their entirety because we had vaccinated our communities.
On the broader perspective, because you have mentioned the terrible examples of AIDS denialism, and Eastern Europe and Central Asia is one of the regions where this particular form of I would say basically a low level of basic knowledge is very widened, and people refuse to get ARV treatment still till nowadays, and they would prefer get boiled in the water because this would kill the virus at 40 degrees, or whatever other hoaxes and crazy theories they would hear. What do you think is the reason that, like, previously we were talking about evidence-based, and as you mentioned, we were all activists as a broader community, and people started to wash their hands 2 centuries ago and kill the germs with the soap, and now all of a sudden we are back to the level of the discussion that the earth is flat. I am not taking as a response the thing that in US we have a very low education standards in schools, because this is a problem worldwide. We have flat earth community in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, whatever other country you take. What is the reason? Why do you think this is happening?
So I don't know what the case in Russia is, but if you ask Americans, do they believe, how many people believe in angels and ghosts? It's a lot of them. So the point is that there are people all over the world who believe in things that are completely untrue. The one thing that AIDS activists have that we've done well is that you can take beliefs that are untrue and help people understand what the truth is. Treatment literacy, which we've done together in Russia and Eastern Europe and Central Asia, all over the world, basically says, here's how it all works. This is the HIV virus. These are its components. These are the genes in the HIV, in HIV. This is how they work. This is how HIV gets into cells. This is what your immune system does to fight against disease. Here are the drugs for HIV. This is how they work. Here are their side effects, right? And this treatment literacy has been incredibly important. So before I came back to university, I was working in Southern Africa and doing treatment literacy in a tiny kingdom called Lesotho. It's a mountain kingdom surrounded by South Africa. Many people are farmers, right? Rural, it's predominantly rural. And we would go up into the mountains and we would teach people about HIV, the virus, its life cycle, the immune system, opportunistic infections, all the drugs, all the side effects, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, and people understood, right? I will never forget, one time we were in a meeting in Lesotho, and we started talking about peripheral neuropathy, about this tingling and pain in your feet and fingers you can get from drugs like D4T, one of the drugs to treat HIV infection. And everybody was like, oh, I have peripheral neuropathy. And then we said, there's this other drug called tenofovir, which you could replace D4T with, which doesn't have those side effects. And everybody's eyes lit up. Like, why don't we have it here in Lesotho? Well, because you got to ask your government for it, right? And so treatment literacy showed them that the pain and tingling in their fingers was not something from God. It was not something that was fate or destiny. It was the drug they were taking, and you could take another drug and stop it altogether. And so more knowledge and treatment literacy doesn't necessarily combat all the denialism and flat earth thinking, but it's the only antidote to the poison that I know of. And it's incredibly important. And one of the things I think AIDS activists have done in Russia and all around the world have pioneered this and said, it's not just about science for scientists and people in the big institutions of learning and scientific organizations. Science is for the people, right? And if we can get science to the people and explain things in simple terms, we can potentially roll back ignorance just a little bit. People will still believe in angels and ghosts, and there'll still be people who think COVID vaccines are poison and HIV isn't the cause of AIDS. But the point is that we can make them to be a very, very, very tiny minority so they don't do the damage that Robert F. Kennedy and others have done.
Yeah, we turned out to have the discussion not only about Fauci, but the broader world. My last question would be, do you have a feeling that there is, or there are people in US science, in the world science of that magnitude that could take the torch and continue?
So I don't believe in the great men version of history.
Okay.
Whether it's Anthony Fauci or Nelson Mandela or whoever, or Mahatma Gandhi, it's all of us who make the change, right? And so Fauci was a highly visible figure, but there were so many people around him in the scientific community, and I can make a list of 100 people if we sat here for the next half hour, both scientists and doctors, activists, who are responsible for the advances where we are today, just as much as he is. He's a public figure, right? And we like to sort of invest a lot of our hopes and desires and our frustrations on public figures. So Fauci gets beaten up all the time as if he is science, as if he is public health. But there's a whole world out there that's given us the advances we have today. And I still think it's the case. I'm looking at the three of us. We probably all could make lists of 100 people who have changed the world in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in New York and New Haven, for the good in terms of HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, the lives of people who use drugs, the lives of people who are in sex work, etc. So Do we need another Tony Fauci? No, but we definitely need people like us to carry on the fight. You know, other leaders will emerge as Tony retires, but the main point is that he may be retiring, but we can't. So
I think this is the best message we could ever got from this conversation. Thank you, Greg, for your time. I know you are on very busy schedule, so I really appreciate this half an hour.
And I'm anytime you guys want to talk, I'm very happy to talk. Russia has a very special place in my heart. So
yeah, and, you know, and just for you to be sure that this goes beyond Russia, this goes to the whole Eastern Europe, Central Asia. So
the whole region is special in my heart.
Yes, and you know, I know you traveled a lot, so probably next time we speak more about the region.
Cool.
Cool.